Okay, so now we're going to look at how you transition from the evidence and explanation in your first text to your second text. So let's have a look. All right, so we just talked about how you can layer your evidence, put all of the text A evidence together, but kind of layer it. Which would give you the opportunity to have more depth and also show text knowledge. And then we're going to talk about how you transition from one text to the next within the same paragraph. So what you want to do is create almost like a segue sentence to kind of create a nice little flow on, because what you don't want is it to feel like that there is like chunks, right? Even though we do use structure, you kind of almost want it to bleed together a little bit and not seem too obvious. So how do you do that? Well, okay, so what you want to do is you want to highlight a connection or a difference that these two texts have in regards to the idea that you're discussing, which, that sentence that you talk about the connection or the difference will create a nice kind of flow, because you're talking about both of them, and then you're going to transition into talking about the other one. It will create a flow on and you won't sound too choppy. Just make sure that you make a good quality comparison, not just like, just like The Longest Memory, 7 Stages of Grieving is also printed on paper. Like, you want it to be something that is actually a meaningful comparison. So here's my example of like a segue. Similarly, which is obviously a comparison word, similarly in Daguerre's piece, he shows how African American slaves are also, comparison word, are also forced to struggle through the grief of what they and their community have lost, and it is the pain from this grief that prevents them from wanting to encourage their descendants to move beyond slavery. Okay, so by using those comparative words, what I've done is kind of hinted at the text that I did speak about and created a flow to the next one. So yeah, that's my piece of advice. All right, so looking at the next evidence and explanation, you literally use the same tricks that you used in your text A, okay? So I've got my evidence there in the pink, and my blue is my explanation. So I'm still talking about the idea that the pain that comes from the memories is holding these people of colour back from being able to move forward with their lives. Okay, and you'll notice here I'm doing a very similar thing to what I did in my other paragraph, where I've given several pieces of evidence from the same text and kind of given an explanation of each. Okay, and that way you can see just through the colour the amount of comparison, the amount of explanation that I'm giving is, quite significant, particularly in comparison to the amount of pink there is, which is my evidence. So, in his self-titled chapter, Whitechapel intimates that he too was once wild and thirsty for change, for change and freedom when he was young. However, he saw too many healthy, kind, funny young men and women disappear from his life. Okay, so I want to talk about this evidence. It's embedded. See how he too was once wild and thirsty for change. That's a direct quote. Now, notice that I don't have to go in his self-titled chapter, Whitechapel, who is a slave and blah, blah, blah. I don't need to give in the backstory. Assume that the person has read the text. Okay, so I've embedded the quote, wild and thirsty for change. And then I've embedded another quote where he saw too many healthy, etc., etc. But note that the problem is that he says, from my life. Now, obviously, I can't put my life because I'm not talking about me, I'm talking about Whitechapel. So I use my square brackets and insert the word his life there. Now, I should have a close quotation mark there, but for some reason I've left it off because I'm a fool. Anyway, here's my explanation of that. By Whitechapel directly relating his memories of other slaves trying to escape to his view of seeing any version of freedom as death, it illustrates that it is our memories of traumatic experiences that hold us back from pursuing more for ourselves. Due to Whitechapel's memories of the torture of his fellow slaves, he refuses to dream of any other version of freedom, nor tolerate others doing so. Okay, so I've got a little bit of explanation there. I probably could have given a little bit more depth to it, but because I'm going to be providing several pieces of evidence here that all kind of back up the idea, I can probably be forgiven for not going in as much depth as, you know, I probably could have. And that's why sometimes giving several pieces of evidence and explaining several pieces of evidence, you know, might be another way that you can add depth. All right. The other thing I want to mention about that is that I've embedded another quote, freedom is death, and I've had to make a little change, but it still works. Don't feel like evidence is the only place that you can put quotes. Okay, so then I've hinted at the next piece of evidence that I'm going to talk about, which is, you know, tolerate others doing so, meaning great-granddaughter. So, in the chapter Great-Granddaughter, the great-granddaughter speaks of her dreams of Africa, expressing her longing for freedom through her imagery of flying through the air. I've had to make some slight changes to my embedding so that it flows nicely, but beautiful, okay? So now I'm going to be talking about the symbolism. Okay, so here it's more kind of like plot line character discussion. Here my evidence is going to be symbolism discussion. The universal symbol of flight is representative of the freedom, and Daguerre means to communicate through the great-granddaughter the longing that slaves have when young enough to not be weighed down by memory. Okay, so I explore the idea of you know, flight being representative of, you know, not being weighed down by memory yet, showing that, you know, it is possible to move forward, but, you know, you have to be, you know, unburdened by that memory. Then I'm still talking about the same piece of evidence, the same kind of idea from the text, but I'm tying it in with further evidence. However, Whitechapel's brutal dismissal of her innocent dreams for more, signified by him declaring, "Africa is not for you," illustrates that the traumatic memory not only holds Whitechapel back, but through his actions holds his descendants back too. Daguerre presents this moment of the great-granddaughter's dreams being crushed in order to signify how traumatic memories of slavery have impacted the descendants of slaves by the lessons they are taught by their forebearers. This is commonly referred to as transgenerational trauma or intergenerational trauma, either term is fine. And Daguerre shows that it is the ability to hold back the descendants of those who are scarred from their past, exemplified when Daguerre has the great-granddaughter mourn that her dream of Africa was gone, banished to the place where dreams retreat when they are ridiculed. Okay, so what I've done there is kind of peppered lots of different little bits of evidence and explained each as I go, and then at the end creating this kind of bigger, wider discussion about the topic. Okay, that's another way that you can kind of present evidence and ensure that you do a good job of explaining them. And if you again have a look at just like the ratios of evidence and explanation, you'll see that, you know, I'm getting that ratio right, like that 1/3, 2/3 kind of thing. So 1/3 evidence, 2/3 explanation. Okay. Now let's have a look at how we then do the compare. Okay, but a few tips about evidence and explanations. Once you're confident in using evidence and explanation, you can start switching them around. And I don't know whether you noticed, but I kind of had a little bit more evidence down the bottom, just because, you know, I had it, I knew it, why not put it in? You can start switching them around when it makes sense and bleeding them into each other, but only when you're feeling confident to. Make sure you continue using the tips from the first lot of evidence and explanation. Don't start skimping on your text B evidence just because, you know, it's the second lot you've had to do. You've got to do all your evidence justice. There's no point giving evidence if you don't explain it well, because evidence by itself is worth nothing. It's the explanation that really makes it worth something. Don't mind Molly in the background, just making herself comfortable. Where you can draw parallels to your evidence that you've looked at in text A, do mention it. So if you have moments where you present something and you're like, oh, that's like exactly the same as blah, 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 or, you know, this is completely different, mention it. Remember, it's a comparative essay, so like the more comparison you can fit in, the better. Obviously, you don't want to repeat yourself, but yeah, if you find areas where you're like, oh, I could just like mention that this is similar in the other text, then that's really good to do, because it is obviously a comparative essay. All right, so comparison. Here's a few tips about your comparison bit, okay? So you do a little bit of comparison at the topic sentence, because obviously you introduce the idea and both texts. And you do a little when you segue from text A to text B, but this is really where you're going to show your comparative stuff. This is where, you know, you've got to hit a home run with your comparison. Give as much detail to your comparison as you can, without obviously repeating yourself. It's a great place to embed some quotes in the discussion too, if you can. You don't have to provide evidence for your comparison, particularly because you've probably provided it earlier in the paragraph. But if there are kind of further quotes that you could embed and stuff like that, go for it. This part of the paragraph will feel more like an explanation than a piece of evidence, because it's where you make clear how the two texts are similar or different in regards to your argument. So it should kind of have that sort of vibe to it, that you feel like you know, doing another explanation. And lastly, try and work in those keywords, so you can reassure the marker that this is all very relevant to your overall contention. All right, here's my comparison example. So this would go after the second text discussion. So for me, I've gone topic sentence, evidence from 7 Stages of Grieving, explanation from 7 Stages of Grieving. Then I've gone segue kind of sentence, evidence from like a house on fire, evidence from the longest memory, explanation from the longest memory. Now I'm doing my comparison of the two. So here it is. Memory's weight and its ability to transfer its pain throughout the generations is presented in both 7 Stages of Grieving and The Longest Memory. Both authors saw it as an important enough aspect of their story of their respective people of colour that they made their text reflect this importance in their titles, which obviously refers to the evidence that I gave earlier about 7 Stages of Grieving. But it also reminds, it also says that, hey, it's also done in The Longest Memory, because it's called The Longest Memory. Moreover, 7 Stages of Grieving and The Longest Memory connect the struggles that their people of colour have in moving forward with their dreams because of the pain of the traumatic memories, even either their own, like Whitechapel and Nana from Nana's story, or the intergenerational memories of their forebearers. Okay, so that's my bit of comparison for the paragraph. Now, I didn't speak about Nana's story earlier in my essay, but that doesn't mean I can't refer to it here. As long as I'm kind of, I guess, aware that I have to be specific about it. So, for instance, I've said, you know, Nana from Nana's story, which is in 7 Stages of Grieving, if you're not sure. So, yeah, but I have referred to, obviously, Whitechapel evidence that I gave in the other explanation. Okay, so that's comparison. Let's move to link. Okay, link sentences, the one that everyone forgets. Poor link. So the link is like the paragraph's conclusion. And basically it just sums up what you've argued in that paragraph in one sentence. You know, it should be quite quick. It's a bit like the topic sentence. If you get stuck and you don't know what to write, looking at your topic sentence is a good way to kind of kick yourself in to gear with it. Make sure you use your keywords, or obviously synonyms of them, because you don't want to sound like hella repetitive. You want to obviously, you know, sound like you have some sort of vocabulary. And try and work some comparison in, if possible. Okay, so here's my example. So, these incidents, given in Mailman and Enoch and Daguerre's texts, are presented to give universality to the concept that people of colour have been restricted by the pain in their pasts. So again, I just connect the idea from, you know, the argument from the paragraph, and I just mention it again and say, yes, I am answering your question. Here is the answer to your question. You know, people of colour have been restricted by the pain in their past. That's how it's affected them. Okay? That's it. That's it. That's it. Now, I know it is more complicated than, say, you know, a standard, bog standard text response structure. You know, there is more layering and stuff like that. I mean, you could keep it a little bit more simple than I have. You know me, I'm very extra. So, you know, you may not want to do like as many amounts of evidence as I have, you know, evidence explanations for each text. That's okay. Go quality over quantity always. Okay? If you gave one really great piece of evidence for each text, but you really use those 4 questions, you really kind of pulled everything apart, and it was super relevant, and you had really good ideas, and there was real depth in that discussion, you could score just as well as me giving multiple pieces of evidence with shorter amounts of explanation. Just kind of think about that like 1/3, 2/3 ratio, that you should always write way more explanation than you do write evidence, so that you can really make sure that you're giving the depth that your marker wants. And as for comparison, you know, try and not just do the one throwaway sentence, try and make it a couple of sentences of discussion. And remember, you've got a bit of comparison in your intro, in your segue, and in your conclusion as well. Sorry, yeah, not intro. Topic sentence, segue, and link sentence. You've got some comparison in there too. So, you know, between all those things, you will add up to having quite a lot of comparison, just kind of sprinkle throughout. All right, last but not least. Oh, so sorry, there's the whole thing together. If you wanted to see the whole thing together, you can see that primarily there is way more blue than there is anything else. And the blue is explanation. So it should be that way. Okay. Last but not least, let's talk about conclusions. I have very little to say about conclusions because they're so bloody simple. They are exactly the same as your introduction. You need TACA, title, author, contention, arguments. That's it. Like literally go back to your intro, read it, reword it, put it there. Easy. Okay? Don't ask me about conclusions. They're so easy. Okay, but make sure you do have one. If you see that you're running out of time, you'd be better off writing 2 paragraphs and adding the conclusion and spending some time doing some proofreading than these kids who write these essays and they've got a brilliant first paragraph, they've got a pretty good second paragraph, they've got a really rushed third paragraph that doesn't finish, doesn't really do the job, and they've done no conclusion, no proofreading. Do 2 paragraphs, do the conclusion, do the proofreading, okay? I know you might have had a really great idea earlier, but you know, you got to cut your losses. You didn't stick to your time plan. Got to cut your losses there. All right, so that's it. I look forward to your drafts, my darlings. See you soon. Bye.